Betting, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Bet with the Best podcast. Its mission is to explore better ways to bet on races, to seek out new, successful players, and to boldly go where no podcast has gone before. The Bet with the Best podcast is sponsored by Amwager, an ADW built by horse players for horse players. Speed, power, and ease of use are at the core of Amwager, designed to give players the information and tools they need to quickly make anything from a simple win bet to a complex, structured superfecta or pick 5 wager. When you combine that with data and pool updates that are up to 60 times faster than the competition, Amwager is the clear winner in wagering on races online. Those are just a few of the many special features that Amwager has to offer, along with live video and race replays, free, integrated form-to-win past performance information, conditional wagering, and true odds, which are a prediction of off odds based on all available pool data. That and much more. Amwager is licensed and operated in the U.S., and best of all, they will actually pay you to play. If you sign up now and deposit and bet $150, you will earn a $150 lump sum bonus. So there is no reason not to give Amwager a try. If you want to bet with the best, then you need the best tools to wager with. You need Amwager. Welcome to episode 18 of the Bet with the Best podcast. Joining this week is someone who really needs no introduction. He's now retired, but was a longtime racing executive, publisher, author, horse owner, horse player, and player advocate. I'm very pleased to welcome Steve and Chris to the show. How's it going, Steve?
Going well, Chris. Thank you.
Well, I usually like to kick things off, and it'd be real interesting to hear your story here, sort of what I call the horse player origin story, and how you got involved in this crazy game, and in your case, how it kind of evolved into a lifelong career. So please, if you would share with the listeners your horse player origin story.
My origin story doesn't begin until sophomore year of college, the summer between sophomore and junior years. And one night a friend said to me, "Hey, you want to go to the dog track?" And I said, "What's a dog track?" And about 2 hours later, my academic career was over. Went to Wonderland Greyhound Park in Revere, Massachusetts, and it immediately struck a chord with me. I loved it. I couldn't get enough of it. Pretty much went every night the remainder of the summer and for most of my last 2 years of college. And a few days after going to Wonderland, I went out to Suffolk Downs, which was only one subway stop away from the dog track. And, you know, Suffolk's not the most delightful place in the world, but I still went out there occasionally. And then when I came back to New York and I went to Belmont Park, that was wow. And I was lucky enough the first time I went to Belmont, there was a 2-year-old stakes race, and the 2 main entrants in it were named Affirmed and Aladar. So that was a pretty nice introduction to the game.
Wow, that was a pretty good race to watch. Those two. It wasn't the last time they were going to meet each other either.
No, I think.
But you did make it through. Excuse me. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just saying. I think it was the second or third time that they ran against each other, and Affirmed beat Aladar that day. But I became an Aladar fan from therefore on.
That would be sort of like being a Cubs fan for a while or a Mets fan right now. But you did make it through college, even though you the racing bug bit you. You did make it through, right? and
Yeah,
graduated?
I graduated sort of by the skin of my teeth, and did not do anything with my senior thesis on Alexander Pope and the metaphysical poets. That did not come in handy in life after school.
So you were a liberal arts major then, I take it?
Yeah, I was an English major.
All right. So that you got the bug, but how did that develop into eventually, getting into racing game from a career standpoint? But how did your horse playing evolve? When did you become a really serious player? And how did that happen?
Well, actually, just before graduation, I got an entry-level job at the New York Times as a night copy boy, and so that freed up my days to go to the track or play the races in New York through OTB. I was a recent college graduate with only a couple of nickels to rub together, but I began going every day, and then 2 months later, there was a big newspaper strike for the next 60 days. So I really became a regular at the track. And when the strike was over, a lot of people had left during the strike, and there were some openings. And I moved up to the op-ed page, but spent the next couple of years trying to get the racing writer's job, which I eventually did in 1981.
So you started covering racing for the New York Times, and you were and that gave you an excuse to be at the track every day, I guess.
Yeah, it was. It's one of the greatest gigs in the world to get paid to go to the racetrack every day, I really was self-taught because I hadn't grown up around racing. I bought a guy's collection of racing books and tried to read all of them and get up to speed and able to cover things. Before I actually got the job, the way I sort of auditioned for it was volunteering to go places. They wouldn't necessarily send their racing writer to Florida or California to, cover Triple Crown preps. So I would just say, hey, I'll go to California and cover the Santa Anita Derby for you. So, that's how I got my on-the-job training.
Wow, that sounds great. So how did your play as a horse player? I mean, so you started learning the game, learning the betting side of the game. When did you kind of tell yourself, this is something that I can maybe turn a long-term profit? You don't necessarily have to be a loser when you go to the track. When did that start to click for you?
I think it really began to click via the Pick Six, which in the early and mid 80s in Florida, I got to spend my winters in Florida. Because I was able to say, hey, Andy Byer spends the winter in Florida for the Washington Post. I mean, you guys don't want to look bad by comparison, do you? So I got to spend my winters down there, and Andy had a little group going that played the Pick Six, and I joined that, and I really loved that bet. And at the time, I think people really had no idea how to play it. They just made out one ticket with as many horses as they could afford, whereas we were putting in multiple tickets with A horses and backups. And when New York instituted the Pick Six, I think it was 85, 86, somewhere in there, I really attacked it. And as I say, there was a great opportunity there because people hadn't really figured out how to play the bet. Also, I was making my own speed figures, and there were no published speed figures in the past performances then. So that was another huge edge. So I very successfully played the Pick Six over the next 5 or 10 years. Then the rest of the world began catching up, and we put speed figures into the Racing Times and eventually into the Racing Form. So that edge dried up. But I think that principle endures to this day, that if you can get out ahead of the crowd on a bet type, which I think I did in the early days of the pick five, more recently, until people really figure out how to play these bets and where the value is in them, you've got an edge.
Yes, that topic has come up many times on this podcast where, change is sort of an opportunity, whether it's a new bet or something changes. If you can get it out in front, you can have that edge. It doesn't last forever. People catch up, but that does seem to be a reoccurring theme. And it sounds like you took advantage of that early on with the pick six. And like you said, recently the pick five has become, a very popular bet, and lots of tracks feature it with a low takeout. So you kind of were able to apply the same principles there. Let's talk a little bit about, because I know you've always been known for the pick five and the pick six, and some of the writing you've done has been around that. And I don't know if you developed it, but you sort of popularized the ABC method of, ticket structure for those pick bets. Can you maybe spend a little bit more time explaining that and contrasting that with kind of a typical caveman ticket, and why you think that provided, a big edge, at least early on in the pick six?
Yeah, I think the edge that you get by putting in multiple tickets and of having main horses and backup horses is that you're not valuing every horse that you want to use equally. If you want to use 4 horses in a race, it's pretty unlikely that you think that, all of them have an equal chance of winning. So, if you make 2 of them mains and 2 of them backups, and you think the 2 mains, let's say are each 35% to win the race, and the other 2 horses are only 15%, why would you just want to use all 4 of them in equal strength? So it's a way of monetizing your opinion better than just using as many horses as you can afford in equal strength. The other thing that it allows you to do is that if you're really good in 4 or 5 of the 6 races, by making multiple tickets, you can go much deeper in 1 or 2 of the other races than most people do. If you're right on your main ticket into the last leg, you should have a bunch of backup horses in that last leg. That if you were making a single caveman ticket, you're not going to go 8 or 9 deep on a caveman ticket, unless you have a ton of money to put into the thing. So, I think that multiple tickets both allow you to monetize your opinion within the race and to pick up some fringe horses who send the payoff skyrocketing.
And that makes a lot of sense. And I think that, you help popularize that. And like you said, more and more players probably have gravitated towards multiple tickets in the caveman ticket structure. One of the things about that you mentioned, the likelihood of winning, was that really your focus on the pick six, was trying to identify the likely winners? Or were you taking value into account at all when you kind of focus in on your key horses? Was your A horse always the most likely winner, or sometimes maybe it was the second or third most likely winner, but one that offers really good value? I mean, how did you factor that in, if at all, in your ticket structure when you approach those pick sixes?
Yeah, I think it absolutely does matter what price the horses are, because price can turn a B into an A. Let's say you like 3 horses in a race, and you gauge their likelihood of winning at 40, and 20%. Well, if the 20% horse is going to be 8-1 or higher, I make him an A. I don't want to give up the 4x value on that horse over the 2 likelier winners. So, price can turn a non-A horse into an A because of the value. Similarly, if I think the favorite in a race is just no better than 2 or 3 other horses in the race, I may demote him, to a B, because anytime that you can knock out a horse who you think that a lot of people and a lot of small players will be leaning on or singling, again, that gives you superior value.
So you brought up a good point there. When it is a pari-mutuel game, and in the picks, you're going against other players or who are trying to construct their tickets. With that in mind, how do you deal with let's give the example you gave where you found sort of a weak favorite. Will you fade that favorite completely, knowing that maybe a lot of people will be using that horse on their tickets, just from a value standpoint, kind of reallocate that capital to other horses? Or do you kind of, like you said, maybe fade it to a backup ticket rather than on the primary ticket? I mean, how would you approach that, or does it depend?
Obviously, every situation's a little different, but no, I do not, throw out favorites who can win. I mean, what if you're brilliant in the other 5 races? You want to at least use that kind of a horse defensively, so that, if you've been brilliant everywhere else and this favorite does win, I don't want to get nothing or a conso.
So like he would be, say, a B. So like you if you caught all the other legs, you might still have this horse as a backup, even though he's not on the primary ticket.
Exactly.
So when you're looking, and I know that you're not, you're semi-retired anyway, but you're still playing regularly, correct?
I'm playing New York every day. That's what I've decided to do in retirement.
And so, are you still focused primarily on pick 5, pick 6? Is that where you put most of your energy?
Yeah, I put most of my energy into the 2 pick 5s that NYRA offers every day. I only play the pick 6 when there are carryovers or on big days when that even without a carryover you're looking at a pretty good pool.
So on those pick 5s, do you do you pass a lot of them? Do you play them all? What is it if not, if you're only playing them selectively, what is it that's going to get your attention and get your interest in playing a sequence if you look at a pick 5? I mean, what are you looking for that would get you really interested and excited about playing?
I probably play 80 or 90% of them. I mean, I'm not sitting and waiting for some special opportunity. I play most of them. I mean, unless the sequence looks like, there are 3 odds-on winners, who have to fall down to lose, or conversely, that it's just an impossible sequence, loaded with first-time starters, you're not going to see the board. I will pass, but more often, whatever the puzzle is, I try to solve it.
So let's take the example you gave where you've got a pick 5, and it's pretty hard, especially the late pick 5 at NYRA, not to have at least 1 or 2, big field maiden races or state bred maiden races that are kind of wide open. How do you typically approach those in the pick 5? Are you hoping you can find a horse you can lean on, or are you typically trying to spread? And if you spread, how do you approach that, especially like with an ABC method? I'm just curious how you tackle those races, which tend to come up regularly if you're playing the pick 5.
Well, they've gotten pretty good in New York about not burying those races in the middle of those sequences. They'll put races with a lot of firsters as the first leg of the early pick 5 or the first leg of the pick 6. And for a long time, I was sending, notes to the racing office once a week saying, why did you make the 5th race the 7th race? And, why don't you do this differently? And I think there has been a lot of progress. So, you don't have those situations. During Belmont and Saratoga, when DRF has clocker reports, those are incredibly helpful for races with firsters. Not that they pinpoint, horses you can single, but just horses who are working badly as opposed to horses who are working well. At Aqueduct, it's a little tougher because they don't have the clockers up here in the winter, so those are a little bit more blind.
In the winter, do you still stay with the New York circuit, or do you look south to Gulfstream when a lot of those horses from New York travel south, or are you still focused primarily on the New York circuit?
No, I still focus on New York. These are horses I've been dealing with all year, and that I know very well. I have issues with Florida racing and the amount of handle there that's driven by the CAW players. So New York is my main thing.
Well, you brought up one of the topics I was hoping we could talk about eventually, but since you brought it up, we might as well talk about it now. The game's changed in a lot of ways over the last 30 or 40 years, but especially in recent years, the computer teams have had a big influence on the pools, and I'm just curious, what you've seen and how you have responded as a player, and what you see going forward in terms of the impact of those teams on the pools and on your ability, to make wagers and turn a profit as a horse player.
Well, they've certainly made it a lot harder to win. And effectively, what the CAW team players have done is to raise the takeout for everybody else. Because if, just for the sake of argument, these guys are playing, at a 0% net takeout, between their rebates and between their skill, that's money that's not being paid out, to the ordinary players. So, speaking very broadly, what was a 20% takeout, 10, 15 years ago is effectively a 30% takeout now. And that makes it a lot more difficult for the rest of us. Also, the teams cover a lot of combinations and a lot of unlikely combinations. So, the chance of scooping a pool, or getting a really outlandish payoff because of one big price winner, isn't what it used to be. It's made it harder. We've lost the players of old who bet on names and numbers and colors. Those people are going to casinos and playing slot machines and lotteries now. They're not playing racing anymore. And they've been replaced by these, very skilled, very sophisticated teams. So, in a way, my hat is off to them. Anyone who can break even in this game is doing very, very good work. But they've made it harder for the rest of us.
So has that changed the way, say, you approach your pick five and how you play it? Are you making plays differently? Maybe trying to find less likely combinations than you did in the past? Or are you spreading more, spreading less? I'm just curious if you've responded in the way you approach things, knowing that they're out there and they're, like you said, covering lots of combinations, really trying to grind out a profit, even the pick five. They're not looking for a big score. They're trying to grind out a profit.
Yeah, I think the one adjustment that I've made is to, I know one thing the CAW teams, they don't use a lot of long-priced horses. Part of their play is just eliminating apparent no-hopers. And so I now try consciously to do more sort of 5 A's and 1 C tickets, to maybe catch one of those horses who they've just tossed out because, their algorithms say the horse is a very unlikely winner.
So you still think that maybe if you can catch that really unlikely winner, that might be one that they miss. And since there's such a big part of the pool, maybe you can even get an outsized return if you can catch one of those, it sounds like.
Yeah, and especially if in other races, you have winning non-favorite A's. I mean, they're playing them so that if they have kind of, 5 A's and one goofball, they're going to have it. But maybe if those A's, include beating an odds-on favorite or two, then you have a chance to beat them.
So, since you're not playing that much in the other pools, I'm just curious, do you think there's certain pools where they're more active or effective than others? Do you think in, the pick 5, pick 6, I know NYRA's taken some steps, supposedly to keep them out of the pick 5, at least out of their special access to the pools anyway, in the pick 5. Is that appealing to you? Is that part of the reason why you're focused on those in the NYRA circuit?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that NYRA does not allow the CAW players into the late pick 5. They're all over the early pick 5, and you can see every day the handle on the early pick 5 is bigger than the late pick 5, even though common sense would tell you it's supposed to be the other way around and there are bigger fields and better races. So I too, I put more generally into the late pick 5 than into the early one, because I know I'm just playing against the non-CAW people. But, I don't really believe that those guys don't also play individually from their individual accounts. I mean, they're, handicapping all these races and playing them in other pools. So I don't think that you're totally free of those people in the late pick 5, but they definitely have, a smaller percentage of the pool than they do in the early pick 5.
It sounds like you feel like, at least for now, there's still some opportunities playing the pick 5, especially the late pick 5 on NYRA. The teams are at least limited in terms of the access to that, and it's more like traditional pools. And you're still pretty comfortable.
Well, as I say, it's gotten harder, and I wish these guys hadn't figured it out, but they have, and so my hat's off to them. Look, there are still every day there are terrible favorites, and anytime there's a terrible favorite, there's an opportunity.
So when you see those terrible favorites, and I know so obviously one way you could attack it is in the pick 5 and trying to beat them in that leg of the pick 5. Does that ever get you tempted to dip into some of the other pools, either horizontal or vertical, when you see a really bad favorite, or do you still pretty much stick just to the pick 5?
No. I'll jump into a race and play exactas and tries if I have a big opinion that if there's a 6-5 shot who I think there's a very good chance he'll be off the board. That's when I'll get involved.
And that's probably one of the biggest opportunities in racing, right? When you think there is an odds-on favorite that is vulnerable, that can really open up value elsewhere in multiple pools.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, it's the only time I play tries is when I'm trying to keep a short-priced horse entirely off the board. Because, if that favorite you don't like runs second or third, the try's still going to pay poorly. People do so much boxing and then keying, a horse in all positions that, you've got to get them off the board. And, bad horses can finish third, especially in a race that, falls apart late. So I think, those are the opportunities. But, playing tries involving the 3 or 4 favorites, it's just a waste of time.
That's a really good point that you make about the favorites tending to get bet not just on top, but second or third in the try. And that, to me, is why a weak favorite, the vertical pools are maybe even more a better opportunity than horizontal, because, if you have a weak favorite, that helps you in one leg in the horizontal, but in the vertical plays, if you think this favorite's going to run off the board, you can take it out of the first, second, and third it's like getting 3 legs of a pick. You're taking them out of all 3. That creates just extra value, I think. So that I've always felt like a really weak favorite, the kind that can run off the board. That's definitely when you want to jump into those vertical wagers like the tries and supers and exactas.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you have a notion about long-priced horses. I mean, exactas and tries, combining the second, third, and fourth choices, are not a good bet either. I mean, you got to get something interesting to happen as well as getting the favorite off the board.
Yeah, that secondary opinion, that where you're thinking you're getting that second opinion, and several of the guests on the podcast have talked about that. Especially now when the pools are more efficient, you really need kind of that second opinion to really find value in those vertical plays.
Yeah, and I think also the lower minimums that we have now, which I think are a very good idea. They just allow more people to participate in more bets. But, at a 50-cent minimum on tries, a lot of people are going all in the third slot.
So, I mean, you're right. It's sort of a double-sided coin. The lower minimums enable people with lower bankrolls to maybe have a better chance of cashing some of these more exotic wagers. But like you said, especially with the teams playing, it tends to reduce the payouts you get on the longer priced horses, right?
Yeah, it works both ways, but I'd still rather have smaller players participating in those pools.
So one of the things that I really appreciated about your writing on racing was, and it really hasn't changed much today, surprisingly, but rather than just talking about how to pick winners and how to handicap races, you spent some time talking about, okay, how do you turn your opinion into a bet and how important that is, and in particular, how to think about a horse race in terms of value rather than in just terms of handicapping and finding the most likely winner. Can you spend a little more time about that, kind of how you kind of evolved to that thinking, and has that changed at all over time? I mean, to me, you were always kind of one of the pioneers, at least in one of the few people who really wrote about this to some extent. So, that's something I like to hear you talk a little bit more about, just value in the context of horse racing, horseplay.
Yeah, I think that's a topic that really hadn't been written about very much, at least within the context of horse race handicapping. A simple value equation, which is that price times probability equals value. I think that too many people still in racing, they look at a price. A horse is 2-1, and they go, "Oh, I don't like 2-1 shots." Well, I mean, if the horse, in your correct opinion, is 50% to win the race, 2-1 is tremendous value. And conversely, if a horse is only 25% to win a race and he's 4-5, he's a horrible investment. Everyone wants to pick the winner and be a hero. And the same horse, can be a bet on or bet against purely because of his price.
Yeah, and that's such a simple concept, but there are still a vast majority of the horse players never seem to grasp that and don't, that to me, they feel like it's about picking the winner. And, if you pass on a horse because of the price and it wins, that's just a bad decision. So I'm just, how do you respond to that? Because you still hear that surprisingly, even now, 20 or 30 years after you first started writing about this.
Yeah, it is, and it's very comparable to buying a stock. You don't buy a stock because you go, "Hey, that's a nice company. I like that company." That company, if the stock is 60 and it should be 40, it's a terrible bet. If it's 20 and it should be 40, it's a wonderful investment. Again, it's not just how likely is this horse to win. It's at what price?
So, given that, and applying that to say other pool, the win pool, it becomes pretty straightforward, and a lot of players will do what you said. They'll like a horse, but they might decide they're going to pass if the price is too low. But many players never get beyond their most likely winner. They'll never play their second or third most likely winner that might be, at a more generous price. What, have you, how would you kind of communicate? I mean, first of all, is that kind of the approach you take? I'm assuming it is. And how do you get people to kind of look past the most likely winner when they're thinking about betting on a race, and knowing that they may be betting against the horse they think is most likely to win, and in fact probably will lose that bet more often than they win?
Well, you just got to kind of sit down and do the math and prove to yourself that your top choice is sometimes a terrible bet. That, if you run the race 10 times and he's only going to win it 4 of the 10 times and he's less than even money, he's a terrible bet. And we're all in this for the long haul. So, you will face the same situation hundreds and hundreds of times. And, everything reverts to the mean and the law of averages. And in the long run, you will come out ahead if you, bet when you have a positive expectation and don't bet when you have a negative expectation.
Yeah, I think the key words that you used in there were long-term. If you think about it from a long-term perspective, it's pretty obvious. If you think about it as, am I going to cash on this race or show a profit today, then it becomes a little tougher. But certainly when you take that longer-term perspective, it's definitely kind of clarifies what would be a good decision and what would be not such a good decision. But now, today with the computer teams playing and the kind of aging mutual systems, we see a lot of these, last second odds drop, which make it hard to know when you think you've identified value or you haven't. So, how have you, or would you suggest people adjust to that aspect of the game? That ability to be able to, see the price, price detection, estimation, relative to what you think the chances of the horse are. That's become much more challenging than it was 20 or 30 years ago. What can players do to adjust for that?
I don't know that there is an adjustment, to be made for that. I mean, yeah, some horses there'll be a huge correction in the last flash. And, I still don't understand why everyone can't just cut off betting when the first horse goes in the gate. They do it earlier at NYRA than in other places. But, this idea that, oh, no, you have to let people see their horse walk into the gate, even if he's number 12, before you close the pool, I don't get it. I don't agree with it. And, I don't think that people are truly past posting, but it looks terrible when a horse goes from 7-2 to 5-2, while he's got a 6-length lead down the backstretch. I don't think, anything nefarious is going on, but it looks terrible. And it makes people grumble and think there is something bad going on.
Yeah, and there has been a move now. Several tracks have started showing the, projected odds based on the doubles from the prior race to give people a sense for what you'd expect the off odds to be, and when there's a big discrepancy between the live odds and that, might help you anticipate when there might be a late odds drop. It seems like those kinds of putting those sort of tools in the regular players' hands would help a little bit in that regard as well.
Oh, I agree completely. I don't know why, for example, at NYRA, when you go into the last race, you could easily put up a screen, of the imputed odds from the double, pick 3, pick 4, pick 5 and pick 6 will pace. I mean, it's just simple arithmetic. I used to do it all the time. Everybody does it when we have these 2-day bets with the Derby and the Breeders' Cup. You know, again, it's very simple math. And I think it would be fascinating to look at a grid where you see that, a horse is 5-1 in a couple of pools, but maybe he's 3-1 in one of the pools, and at least it might, get your attention and make you go back and look at it. If there are first-time starters involved in these races, the closer you get to that race, you begin seeing more action for those horses. But again, that's such a simple screen to create and put up. I wish everybody would do it.
Yeah, it just makes you wonder why it hasn't happened. Especially now, because like you said, the optics are so bad with these late odds changes. If people could, have some simple things that are very doable that would help them, anticipate those things and factor that into their decision making. I just don't understand why it's not supported. But like I said, there is some movement in that direction. It does seem like maybe we'll see that going forward. But certainly, those kinds of little things, like you said, that are doable and have been doable for many years. You just wonder why no one takes the initiative to do that, and it just makes you scratch your head sometimes. What's the industry doing?
In all fairness, things are a lot better for the players than they were, a generation and 2 generations ago. We've made progress in all these areas, and this is the best time to be a horse player in terms of information and convenience. So we're moving in the right direction, but I think there's still a lot more things that could be done.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because definitely there's so much more information and it's so much easier to wager. So in some ways, that's really beneficial, but a lot of us got our edges because it was harder, and if you put the work in, it gave you an edge. Like, beat figures you talked about, if you had your own figures, that was a lot of work, but it gave you an advantage because they weren't readily available to everybody. Now they are. There was lots of examples of that. So, it's looking at it. So in some ways, it's sort of bittersweet, all the changes that have occurred in the last 20 or 30 years. Would you agree with that, or?
Oh, it absolutely cuts both ways. I mean, back in the day, if you had figures and very few other people did, that was a massive edge. I mean, you were supposed to win in those circumstances, and that's now gone. As we said at the beginning, times of change are times of opportunity, and you've always got to be ahead of the market, because the market corrects itself pretty quickly.
So do you see any changes that have occurred recently, or do you see any potential where if you did the work or you got out in front today, or the players that are looking for edges now, where they might look, any ideas about that? What's the next thing that can get you? It may be fleeting, but might get you an advantage for a while. Anything that comes to mind there?
Well, I do feel that the market has solved dirt racing much better than it solved grass racing, and that conventional final time speed figures, while still very useful for grass races, they're a little fuzzier, because pace, plays such a role in the final time of grass races, more so to my mind than in dirt races, that if you really dig into these races, the grass races, there should be some things that not everybody knows and not everybody sees. And I certainly haven't, I'm not claiming I've solved grass racing by any means. And, it can be very difficult in multi-race bets because at first glance, you'll have a 10-horse field and 6 of them are within 2 points of each other. Doesn't happen as much in dirt racing. So, I think there's probably more work to be done with finishing times in grass races. I don't think people have really solved turf sprints, which are a relatively new development. So, I think those are frontiers where somebody, smart and enterprising could probably do some independent work that would pay off for them.
So you're saying you think probably the market's a little more efficient on the dirt racing than it is on the turf racing, and a little extra work might pay off.
Exactly.
That's interesting. I would share that opinion with you. I would echo that as well. I think you're definitely right about that. So a couple other topics I'd like to hit. One of the things, it's not available to everybody, but there's a lot of talk about, especially now with the popularity and the legalization of sports wagering in a lot of jurisdictions, is fixed price betting. Especially, with all we talked about the late odds change and stuff, there seems to be, some appeal to be able to lock in on a price if you could on a horse, and maybe different kinds of prop bets and things like that. What's your feeling about fixed price betting versus pari-mutuel wagering, and do you see a future for that in racing? If so, what would that be? I'm just curious. Have you ever dabbled in it at all yourself?
I haven't. It's been available so fleetingly and never on, the most major circuits and not in New York. So, I mean, sure, in principle, it sounds great if someone makes a mistake on a fixed odds line and I can lock in, on a horse at 6-1 who by post time is going to be 5-2. That's wonderful. But, I don't do a lot of win betting. And as I say, I haven't experienced it myself with the fixed odds. But, in theory, it should work. But, I don't know of anyone who's made fixed odds betting work on a large scale.
What about future wagering? Like there are some even pari-mutuel future bets, but what about if they made it more readily available? People could bet on fixed odds on Derby futures or Triple Crown futures or Breeders' Cup futures or future wagers like that. Is that something you think could get some traction in the market, or is that pretty niche?
I think it's very niche. I can't imagine it amounting to any, significant portion of the handle. And I mean, I think that unless you have a friend who has a horse, or you fell in love with some maiden who's 100-1 to win the Derby, that Derby futures thing strikes me as a dead end and a waste of
time. Okay, yeah. I did find some value in the Preakness future wagering last year because of people were completely mispricing that. I think it'll probably change some this year, but I found that to be a very lucrative market last year. Some ridiculously good and bad prices were in that future wagering that took place prior to the Kentucky Derby, because people were sort of thinking about the Preakness like they would any future wager, and they were making like horses like Forte the same price to win the Preakness as to win the Derby before the Derby was run, which was just absolutely insane. So anyway, so sometimes there is some value in that, but you're right. They're so fleeting and they're offered so rarely. At least now, it's hard to see that being a big thing going forward. You mentioned carryovers at the Pick Six. That's kind of when you get interested at NYRA. When there is a carryover, especially maybe at NYRA, like today there was a double carryover, or was it Saturday? Saturday there was a double carryover. Yeah. do you attack those differently, or do you play them just like you always would? Just the fact you might be able to win more. Or do you maybe invest a little more, trying to make sure you can hit it because of the extra value being provided? I'm just curious if you tackle those carryovers any differently than you would just a normal pick six.
Well, you see, I don't play normal pick sixes. I pretty much only play the carryover. And I play them because, there is a neutral or positive expectation because of the carryover. If I play 100 carryovers versus 100 non-carryovers, it's the difference between getting a return of 80% or 105%. So I'm, again, we were talking, earlier about long term. If you're playing when you're getting, $1.05 back for every dollar you invest, that's a lot better than getting 80 cents back. So those are the ones that I play.
Just the long-term math is, and so you're just going to, take advantage of that when you can, and you figure over the long term it's going to pay off.
Exactly, and you'll get, you get the bigger pools because of the carryovers. They'll attract 5 times the carry.
Do you think that tends to attract sharper money or more casual money, or it's kind of the same mix as on, no carryover?
Oh, I think it's both. I mean, there are people who only play when there's a carryover, and you can see that obviously from the pools, and the regular players are also going to step up their investment. So, I think you get it from more investment from all tiers of the market.
So I think you've answered this question, but I'll throw it out there anyway. Foreign racing, it doesn't sound like you bet it. Do you pay attention at all to racing in Europe or Hong Kong or Japan or Australia, or is it just when the Breeders' Cup comes around, you kind of try to get up to speed on those horses? I'm just curious if you have any interest at all in those.
None, except, Breeders' Cup. I end up going and looking at, some European replays for the horses coming over. But no, I don't think I've ever bet on foreign racing.
So how did your Breeders' Cup go this year? Did you, it was a very chalky Saturday on the Breeders' Cup card. Wasn't a great day for me. I'm just curious, how did that go from you from a betting standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I was, sort of lucky to get my money back for the day. When you have, 7 favorites winning in 9 Breeders' Cup races that day, or, 6 favorites and a second choice, it's just about impossible to make any money. Friday, there were wonderful opportunities. I somehow botched it because I liked fierceness. And, when you like a horse who pays $35 and the other winners are all havable, it's your fault if you don't collect. And it was my fault. I just zigzagged my way out of it.
So you were you went after the pick 6 then, or pick 5, and
I went after the pick 5 on Friday, and for some reason I did not like the Chad Brown horse that won. I don't even remember why. And the male, I can't even remember the horse's name. The one who paid about $20, and I ran second and third in the race, and I think it was a $15,000 or $20,000 pick 5 that was very, very havable.
Yeah, I've been there many times. So we talked about the Breeders' Cup. That was sort of the ultimate big card, but especially in recent years, tracks have sort of gravitated to having these super cards where they really focus their meat around 1 or 2 days. Triple Crown's one example, but you get even Triple Crown preps like the Louisiana Derby, Florida Derby, San Diego Derby. Big cards on these tracks. Do you kind of focus on those? Do you treat those any differently or is it just another day at the races for you when that track, especially for the NYRA circuit, say Belmont or Traverse Day, do you tackle those a little differently? Do you go after them with a bigger bankroll, or is it just another day?
Well, for example, on those days, say Traverse Day or one of the big days in the fall at NYRA, I'll get involved in the pick six even if there's not a carryover, because you're still going to have a pool maybe of 200,000 or 300,000, and with the amount of fresh money and amateur money in those pools, it's almost like having a carryover. But the big days at other tracks really don't interest me at all. I mean, let's say you mentioned Louisiana Derby Day. Yeah, it's their biggest day, and they run a bunch of stakes. I don't know those horses. I don't follow those horses. What possible advantage do I have playing turf sprint stakes at Louisiana Downs with horses I've never heard of? Just because it's Louisiana Derby Day doesn't offer me anything. So I stick to what I know.
And it sounds like that's one way you think you get an edge. You really know the horses in that New York circuit, right? You're familiar with them, and you feel pretty comfortable about playing those races, and that you find you get some edge just in that in and of itself.
Oh, sure, because you have, let's say the people who on Travers Day are playing New York and they don't regularly play New York. And, there's some allowance race in the sequence where a horse ran a 99 last time and nobody else, has run better than a 90. They'll just go, oh, well, this horse is a cinch, and they'll single him. And maybe I know that day the two other speeds in the race didn't break and it was a super inside speed track. And that's why the horse ran a 99 and I'm playing against that horse. So, the familiarity with all these horses' last two or three races gives me a big edge over people who are looking at New York horses, for the first time just because it's Travers Day.
So do you keep track of like track biases, or do you take trip notes and things like that? Or is it just you go off memory of these horses? I'm just curious, do you, how do you capture what you learn and see on these races from day to day, week to week?
There are only so many hours in the day, and you can't do everything. So, no, I do not keep detailed, trip notes. I try to do things from memory. I'm not as much of a track bias guy as, a lot of other people are. I don't think there's a, different magical quality to the dirt every day that changes from day to day. So, I only keep track of the, so clearly biased tracks that even an idiot like me on track bias can see them. And, you're talking about 2 or 3 days a month, not every day there's a different bias going on.
Right. You do get a few tracks in New York in the winter where it is definitely a strong bias, like you said, obvious to everybody. So I guess that's what you're kind of talking about. Those you definitely capture, but you're not into the camp of, oh, today the rail's a little slow or fast, and the next day it flips and that kind of stuff. You're more, if it's an extreme bias, I'm
really only interested in extreme biases because I think that you can make a lot of mistakes thinking that there's a different bias every day, and sometimes just the way the races are run is suggesting a bias that's not really there. I mean, in February at Aqueduct, when you've got, 5-horse fields all day where only 2 horses can possibly win, and they run 1-2 around the track, to me, that's not a speed bias of any kind. It's completely fair and formful racing. You can have a card where almost every race is won on the lead, and if they all figured to win, I don't think there was anything biased about that day.
Yeah, and especially in New York in wintertime, just what you described could happen almost every race on a card.
Sure.
For sure.
And, wet tracks, people think, are speed biased. I think it's an optical illusion to a large degree, because what happens on sloppy tracks is that half the horses don't handle it. So, in your 8-horse field, just take 4 of them out, and the 4 who do handle it are likely to be running 1, 2, 3, 4, for the entirety of the race. And that doesn't mean that there was a bias in favor of forwardly placed horses. It just means that half the horses on the card did no running.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The other part on those sloppy tracks, to me, a lot of it's kickback, and horses just can't handle that. And if you're in front, you're not going to take any kickback. I don't think the track's any faster or anything, but a lot of times, that kickback is what makes the horses just not want to run, because it can be really severe sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So, is there any certain kind of an angle or kind of a horse that has always been sort of your favorite kind of go-to play? And I don't know, I mean, there's a million examples there could be out there, but some kind of a thing, whether it's certain kind of a pace or condition or type of horse on layoffs or I mean, is there some angles that have always been really kind to you, or that you see, repeatedly help you, make good scores in the races? I'm just curious, is there anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are dozens of little ones. I mean, a couple that come to mind are in dirt sprints, of finding situations where there's an inevitable meltdown ahead, where you've just got too much pace in the race, and unless somebody falls on his head coming out of the gate, there are going to be 4 of them across the track at full speed going into the turn, because then all those horses can be running sideways, and the worst horses in the race can pass the tiring speeds late. So if I can find a scenario like that, I will box the closers, I'll lean on the closers, and, I'm talking about the kind of hopeless on paper looking closers, who may be 20 and 30 to 1. So I'm always on the lookout for a potential meltdown. One other that I've always liked is a 2-turn horse cutting back to 7 furlongs. I mean, this was Woody Stevens' favorite play 40 years ago. He loved to turn back his 2-turn mile and a 16th horses to 7/8. It works a lot. So that's another angle. Anytime I see that, I perk up a little.
On the 2-turn horses, do you like horses that tend to be, stock and pounce types, or horses that tend to be forwardly placed? I mean, what would be, or does it matter, on that cutback? Are you looking in terms of the running style?
I mean, the best scenario is if the horse runs a great 7 furlong race in the mile and a 16th race, makes a middle move, gets to the lead or in contention, and just doesn't want to go that final 1/8 of a mile, because you can say, aha, 7 furlongs is going to, suit him perfectly.
So they make that move that looks like they're going to win, and then they just don't finish the race off. You think, they just need to cut back a little bit, and then they'll be able to finish the race off. That's kind of the way you're thinking on that?
Exactly, yeah. I mean, I'm not really interested in a horse who sets a slow pace all by himself and then folds up. But, a horse who does enough running in the middle or first 3/4 of the race, to make you think that a 1-turn shorter distance is going to be just right.
Is there any horse that comes to mind that you scored on a cutback like that, maybe in a big race? Anything?
Oh gosh, not off the top of my head, no. But it does seem to work.
Yeah, I know we're always looking for that horse on the Triple Crown Trail. Who's going to be your H. Allen Jerkins horse? That was really a sprinter. That once they cut him back, he's going to become a much better horse. Kind of. I know that comes up all the time. now, as you kind of follow the 3-year-old through the Triple Crown Trail.
Sure. I mean, a horse like Jack Christopher, he just wasn't going to be a 2-turn classic horse, but, boy, was he a good 7-furlong horse. Jackie's Warrior. I understand why if you have a very talented, fast horse, you got to see how far he'll go. I mean, some of them do go the classic distances. Most of them don't. But, when you get up to the 1.125 races, and clearly even that's too far for them, then you cut them back and you run them in the Woody Stevens or the Jerkins, and, they're seriously good horses up to a mile.
Yeah, you see that repeated almost every year with some of these horses that you got to take a shot. Sometimes taking the shot sets them back for a while, but they come back later as a 3-year-old or 4-year-old. A lot of times they become really good, like you said, 7-furlong, maybe 1-turn mile kinds of horses. So you definitely see that all the time.
Yep.
So, just kind of starting to wrap things up a little bit here. What do you think is probably the biggest mistake that most horse players make that if they could address that would probably really improve their result?
I think a lot of horse players don't keep track of their action. And I think that's a huge mistake. Write down every bet, put them on a spreadsheet, resort them by bet type and race type, find out what you're good at. Nobody's good at every type of race. I've never met that genius. But if you know your own strengths and weaknesses, it's going to allow you to play much smarter, both in terms of getting more involved in the races where you've been successful in the past, less involved in the races that you just haven't, they're your Achilles heel or they're the kind that you haven't figured out. And say in multi-race bets, to find out what you're doing wrong in certain kinds of races. Let's say that, just an example, and I don't have data to back this up, but I think that in maiden claiming races, people automatically cast a big wide net because they're not good horses, and maybe they've only run once or twice, and boy, maybe the light will go off today and they'll turn into a different horse. They don't turn into different horses. Horses who have run twice and been beaten 30 lengths both times, I'm sorry, they don't have any ability. They're probably never going to win a race. And that made maiden claiming races a lot easier for me. That 2/3 of the horses in a maiden claiming race are never going to win a horse race. So, why are you trying to wake up 20-to-1 shots all the time when, in fact, you can probably get through those races, using the horses who have been close, who have run respectable seconds and thirds, rather than the horses who have been 10th and 12th in their 2 starts.
I really like that because, like you said, the tendency would be to spread in a race like that, especially those tend to be the biggest fields in the sequence a lot of times in maiden claimers. So if you can actually narrow those down, that would give you a really big advantage in, say, a pick 5 or a pick 6. So, and like you said, you say 2/3 of them, maybe 80 or 90% of those horses will never win a race, depending on what kind of maiden claiming you're like. If it's a bottom level maiden claiming, that probably most of them will never win a race, right? So
yep. So I think really you want horses who are taking severe drops for maiden special, and you want the horses who have run well in the maiden claimers. But horses who have run badly for that same tag in the past, I don't think you want them going forward.
And like you said, there can be quite a few of those in one of those races, that have been at that level for a while, or at least 2 or 3 races. So that's interesting. I like that. So what's the biggest lesson that you learned throughout, your experience in terms of, playing the races? What was the thing that really helped you, once you learned that lesson, it kind of really made a big difference in the results that you were getting?
I don't think there was, a single epiphany, but I do think that record keeping, discipline, constant self-examination, always trying to learn new things. Don't just get lazy. Don't start handicapping 20 minutes before the first leg of a sequence. Look at every horse in the race. Don't just run your eye through the field once and say, oh, well, only these two horses can win. You're not doing enough work. You're not doing enough thinking. So, I mean, I know that doesn't sound very catchy, but just consider every horse. Go through every horse in the race. Don't try to quick cap. Quick handicapping never works for anyone. I mean, you get lucky occasionally, but, now you're just playing roulette.
So when you go through that every horse, what are kind of the main things that you're looking at when that first pass through the race? You're looking at each horse. Like you said, you don't want to just blow through it. What are some of the things you're asking yourself about each horse when you look at them, that first time through?
I think all the standard things. If I could only look at one piece of information, it would be a speed figure. Yes, they can be misleading. Yes, they don't. The top fig doesn't always win. But I think the most useful thing about speed figures is they tell you who can't win. Just a horse who's never run within 10 points of par for the race or of the favorites in the race, and there's nothing new going on today, I just put an X through them and move on.
And that, it makes sense for sure. All right, so this is something I give each of the guests a chance to kind of weigh in on. It's a mythical question, but if you had a magic wand and you could, for a day make some changes to the racing game, not all the changes you'd make, but what are the 2 or 3 things that if you could change in racing, you would, to try to make it a better game, and make the industry, healthier going forward? What would those changes be?
I think primarily if I truly have a magic wand, I would wave it to find some way to keep horses in training longer. Why are Fort and Up to the Mark being retired? These are horses who gained a following, who would probably be even better next year. And I don't understand why, people with a ton of money, you need to get that one extra year at stud in. And I just think the game would be more popular if horses stayed in training longer. I think horses should run more often than they do. This kind of newfangled idea of, a horse can have an 8-week layoff into the Derby. I don't think horses run enough. I don't think they run enough at 2. And all the science says that running horses more often at 2 keeps them sounder, keeps them in training longer. So, I'm kind of dismayed by the tendency for less racing and early retirement. And I'd like to fix that, but I don't have a way without that magic wand of yours.
You're not thrilled about 2 or 3 races a year campaigns for the best horses, and they retire at 3, right at the top, right as they're starting to get good? You're not a big fan of that?
Apparently not.
Yeah, especially a horse like Up to the Mark, where, I would think as a sire, thing I like about turf racing is they don't typically get retired right away. A lot of times they stick around because the turf racing isn't as hot a market from a breeding perspective. But so I was a little surprised that Up to the Mark got retired. Fort was no surprise to me because, it seems like any 3-year-old that's won a grade 1 is going to get retired as a 3-year-old nowadays. But that was a little disappointing. And you know, these campaigns where now they train up to the Derby, and they train up to the Travers, and they train up to the Breeders' Cup. I mean, the campaign that Arcangelo had was kind of strange. You know, he was a late developer, and then they just stopped racing him. And he ran once, I think, the last half of the year.
Yeah, it's a shame, and there really is no easy solution. But you know, I mean, Flightline may well be the best horse since Secretariat. I mean, Flightline was a tremendous racehorse, and his career was 6 races. I mean, I understand how valuable he is, and the risks in continuing to race him, and you know, he did prove about everything that a horse can prove. But still, you'd like to see, you know, if he's one of the greatest horses in the last 50 years, you'd like to see him run more than 6 times.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and he was brilliant. And it was fun to watch him run when he did run. But it's 6 starts. It's just, to me, when you look through the past performances of some of the, you know, the stars of yesteryear, where they would run 6 times in 6 weeks, you know, during the Triple Crown, you know, the top 3-year-old in the country. It's mind-boggling to see you know, how it's evolved in the last 10 or 15 years to the point where
you know, I think there's a lot of, you know, monkey see, monkey do that goes on, and he'll go, well, you know, Todd Pletcher does well, you know, giving horses a lot of time between races. So, you know, he's successful, so I'm going to do that too. You know, I mean, it's not that long ago that, you know, Tom Ainsley was writing handicapping books, and rule number 1 would be eliminate any horse who has not raced in the last 14 days. I mean, that's, you know, I mean, there was something wrong if you didn't run your horse back in 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's hard. That's just seems unfathomable. But you're right. I think I have that book.
Yeah.
That Tom Ainsley book, and I think I remember reading that. So I'm glad you reminded me of that. Okay, so anything else that we haven't covered that you want to get in, you know, that you want to share, that any topic or comment that you'd like to make?
I'll throw in a couple of my favorite chestnuts. I think it would be disgraceful to alter the timing of the Triple Crown. I think that so much of its appeal is that there are only 2 weeks between the Derby and the Preakness, and it's just a disservice to history to go changing it around at this point. So I'm a strong opponent of stretching out the Triple Crown, and I'm also a strong opponent of synthetic tracks. I mean, they're fine for minor racing in inclement, you know, parts of the country, but for quality racing, you know, there's a reason there's not a single Grade 1 race on a synthetic track. We tried this 10, 15 years ago. It just about wrecked racing, and you know, I think we've made so much progress with dirt tracks. They're getting safer all the time. You know, the difference between dirt and grass or synthetics is narrowing every year. I think it'll only get better. And, you know, I'm a big proponent of dirt racing. That's where most of the greatness comes from.
Yeah, I remember when they were doing the experiments, I don't know the experiments, but when you know, there was a big push to move to synthetic a while. I'm losing track of time, but it was probably like 15 years ago, maybe. Out in California, I remember Bob Baffert would just, his lament was, you know, it takes away their brilliance. That was what he would say. In terms of he had
another good line about it. He said, synthetic tracks make good horses look mediocre, and mediocre horses look good. And that's absolutely true.
So you're not a big fan, at least at the major league level, with synthetic. And I know they're putting a synthetic track in New York. What do you think about in terms of like that surface giving turf horses something to train on and maybe even run on in the wintertime in New York? Is that Is that something that you're in favor of, or are you pretty much against synthetics in total?
I mean, if people want to train on them, fine. If you want to use it for off the grass racing, when there are weather issues, but it's hard enough to, we before grass racing became, as prevalent as it has, which is not necessarily a good development. You had short races and you had long races. Now you have races long and short on dirt, long and short on grass, with turf sprints having joined the party. Now you want to add long and short on synthetics, to that. I mean, to me, it's just a recipe for splitting up what should be good 10-horse races into a lot of 5-horse races.
Not only to mention how difficult it is on speed figure makers in terms of having data to work with on a day-to-day basis when you have, like you said, 3 surfaces, multiple distances, multiple run-ups and rail settings. So you're right, it can become very problematic. And in this day and age where horse field size is such an issue as well, you bring up a good point. All right, anything else? Any other chestnuts you want to get in before we go?
I think I've gotten all my complaints out.
All right. Well, I really appreciate it. Like I said, you've always been someone that I thought's been sort of a pioneer in the game, and I also appreciate a lot of the stuff you've done as a horse player advocate. Changes in the game to help the horse player. I tried to do a little bit in that regard myself, kind of following your footsteps. It does seem like the horse player typically is kind of viewed as a necessary evil almost, as opposed to being the primary core customer of the game. So your advocacy is appreciated. A lot of players might not even know what you've done, but I know for many years you've spoken up on behalf of the players, and I appreciate that. So I want to thank you for that, and thank you for joining me, this week on the show. And I'm sure all the listeners will really enjoy this, and I want to thank them for listening and helping me make this podcast a success. And may you all boldly go where no horse player has gone before.
Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate your kind words and the attention of anyone who's been listening to all this. We've made a lot of progress as horse players. I mean, when you think about lower minimums and better breakage and finally getting rid of those onerous W2G withholdings and reportings. So, there is hope to improve the game. And I hope you younger folk continue to try to do it, because I'll be playing it.
Yeah, the W2Gs, I'm proud to say I played a small role in advocating for that in Washington. So that was a huge win. I think a lot of the younger players maybe came into the game after that and don't realize what a big deal that was, especially for someone like you who plays the pick 5 on a regular basis. I mean, if you ever had to do your own taxes at the end of the year, and you have to hand enter a bunch of these forms, and you've had that money withheld all year and you can't get to it until the end of the year, I don't think they realize what a big change that was for the industry. It was huge.
It was huge. I mean, that was just brutal, and it took 20 years to get rid of it. And finally we did. But, I don't want to turn into the old guy telling the youngsters, we used to have to walk to school in the snow for 10 miles either.
Yeah, but we are that guy because.
But we did. Yep.
Sometimes, yeah, it's true. I mean, I didn't have you when you mentioned that earlier. I didn't have you kind of give examples of how it's so much better today than it was. But even I failed to appreciate that when I stop and think about, say, 30 or 40 years ago, what it was like to play the races and what it's like now. It's like there's so many changes that were great that you don't
remember or appreciate, and many players never experienced. You're right. I mean, we do need to every once in a while stop and think about how good it is rather than just focus on all the issues, because there are quite a few issues, and it is frustrating when they don't seem to get addressed. But you're absolutely right. And probably wasn't ever a better time to be a horse player or a worse time to be a horse player than right now.
Yeah, it's gotten tougher, but it's gotten better too.
All right. Well, thank you, Stephen, and good night, everybody.
Thanks.